Senegalese democracy is in a coma. Why is it in a coma?
There have been death, violence, and a question of a third term.
A lot of violence, a lot of repression, a dissolved party. We are fighting this injustice that is rampant in the country. Do you understand? Macky Sall wants to force his dictatorship on us.
But the real truth is that there has been this injustice, and it is being felt by the Senegalese people who are increasingly living in crisis.
This culminated in the internet being cut off and access to social media being cut off.
It's don't force it. That's what we want the Senegalese to understand. Every Senegalese person, before even saying his prayers, says 1 or 3 or 400,000, 500,000 prayers. This is important.
She's crying because this is deplorable. They made her cry. We are here with our little brothers, our big brothers, our cousins. Senegal is one country and no one must divide it.
Listen to Senghor's speech when he left office. He said, democracy is not about staying in power forever. Democracy is alternating in power.
How can we tell them today that presidentialism is a problem?
First term, okay. Second and final term, no more.
Senegal has a rich and complex political history. It is marked by the struggle for independence, the consolidation of democracy, and contemporary challenges relating to governance and democracy. Senegal is often cited as an example of democracy in West Africa. It has achieved several peaceful transitions of power and maintained relative political stability. However, contemporary challenges underline the importance of democratic vigilance and citizen participation in order to preserve the gains made and continue to make progress towards fair and inclusive governance.
There can therefore be no hesitation. Senegal's policy, clearly defined, has set its 3 objectives, which are, in order in which it wishes to achieve them. Independence.
I want to tell them this. If they want independence, let them have it on 28 September. Yes, independence. Let the sign bearers take it on 28 September. But if they don't learn, then let them do what France offers them, the Franco-African community.
What is democracy? Throughout the ages, humanity has sought ways of living together, guided by principles of fairness and justice. For many, democracy is the expression of the quest, born of aspirations for freedom. It is the ground on which every voice aspires to be heard, where every vote is a pillar of our collective coexistence. But beyond its ideal, what reality does it embrace? Let's set off to discover this luminous idea, exploring its roots, its principles, and its power to transform the world. By the way, what is democracy?
Democracy is a vast program, a vast word. Can democracy be defined?
Look, the definition that everyone knows is power of the people, by the people, and for the people.
It already requires a certain level of understanding of the principles and issues at stake.
That's a big problem. It's the very indeterminacy of the definition of a people. It is therefore a power of representation that the people entrust to institutions, which they exercise under their supervision. But all these definitions are, if you like, rather narrow. Democracy is the ability of the people, of citizens, to express themselves. It means freedoms, respect for fundamental freedoms, freedoms of expression, freedom to think, freedom to create. That's part of democracy.
Democracy is a form of political organization in which the holders of power exercise it through a concession.
For me, democracy is nothing other than the translation of the common collective aspiration of a population or a group of individuals who have decided together to set standards, to set legislation, to set a way of life, and to set societal rules that govern their behavior, their adjustment also, and the way they conduct politics. So it is the power of those who have decided to make it a power.
Mais le peuple a le pouvoir. S'il ne me croit pas, qu'il essaie un troisième mandat pour voir. Yeah.
So, although democracy shares universal principles, it adapts and changes according to cultures and histories. Well, in that case, can we talk about several democracies? Or can we talk about an African democracy? What defines an African democracy? How are African people shaping their own path towards participatory governance?
We could say African-style democracy. Why not? Some even go so far as to say democratic dictatorship. Democratic dictatorship is a new concept, a term that is a cross between democracy and dictatorship, because in reality, all our leaders are Republican monarchs. They are modern-day monarchs, and if you look at the fullness of their power, they concentrate an enormous amount of power. A democracy cannot cope with all these power concentrated in the hands of one person, which means that in the end, we can talk about democracy or an African-style system of governance.
Each society, because of its history and context, has its own appropriate form of democracy, its way of organizing power, so that this power can be redistributed or shared in such a way that the people themselves, in other words, all the components of this society, can truly be the holders of this power.
We can think of the constitution of Theano Suleiman Baal, even the Islam we have at the beginning of the time of the Prophet. There was a certain vision of democracy, what is called the Shura, or consultation among Muslims, especially from the period of Medina, between the Ansars and the Muhajirans. There was consultation. It was the Shura.
Long before the onset of imperialism, Africa had its own form of cultural organization. It must stem from the death, in an endogenous, inclusive way, from the death of the political, and I do mean political, social, societal and cultural aspirations. I was also going to say religious aspirations of the populations that make up a whole, i.e. a society, which was based on values, which was based on power sharing, based on sharing of knowledge and assets.
In our history, we have known a certain form of democracy, at least from the point of view of myths. I am thinking of the Kurukan Fuga Charter.
But even before talking about the Mandan Charter, here we have a kingdom like Kayo, where the king, of course, not only had very strong attributes, as everyone knew, he was the Damel, but the king was elected and not much is said about it. So there were 7 princely families here in Kayo, in Senegal, long before the imperialist push. And it was these 7 families who could grant the rights, the Damel, and the Damel himself could not ensure his own investiture. There was another family called the Kagan. So this was a lineage that could be a kind of prime minister or vice president. So they could ensure what was called the investiture. We all know that it's the vote that confers the choice, but it's the investiture that gives power. In Europe, I meant to say that the West fought for hundreds of years to stabilize their political system. And some of these countries have always managed to preserve their ancestral realities. I mean to say their social realities. They have kingdoms, kings, queens, and monarchies. But they also have a democratic model that meets the demands of their people. In Africa, it's a shame we don't talk about this enough. We were the first continent to experiment with democracy in practice. Europe came up with a theory, theorizing the concept of democracy and conveying democracy as an international concept, a universal concept.
Yes. That's all well and good. But what exactly is a democratic system? More than just a set of laws and institutions. Is it the breadth of the part? Is this what happens in the polling booth? Is it the heart of public dialogue? Does it mean a free press? But how do these mechanisms ensure that every vote really counts? Let's take a closer look at the workings of democracy. Elections, the separation of powers, and the protection of freedoms.
When we think about democracy, going back to Montesquieu's spirit of the laws, with the balances and equilibrium between the different institutions, it is a bit of a, how would I put it? You can't talk about democracy without checks and balances on the institutions. It is power that stops power, but under the watchful eye of the people.
But the big problem is the definition of the people. Is it the sociological people? Is it the electoral people? Is it the trade union people? The big problem we have, and have been posing since 2008 to 2009, is to modernize the institutions.
It has to be said that for some years now, there has been a certain dissatisfaction between the people and the institutions of the Republic, especially the judicial institutions, which are very repressive, and the institutions of the DFS, the Defense and Security Forces. But I think it's fair to say that over the last few years, we've also seen on both sides a demonization of our institutions, but also that there is a very partisan treatment of some of our institutions, especially legal institutions, in relation to certain political players.
It's about having institutions today, whether they be Republican institutions, impartial institutions, institutions capable of resolving the conflict we have in a peaceful manner.
Do we have a Republican institution in this country today? Does Senegal have a republic? Do we live in a republic? Because I see the way people are treated, depending on whether you're in power or in opposition. I work in Senegal. When you're in opposition, the sword often falls on you. When you are in power, you are often protected. I'm going to put this question to President Macky Sall. It asks why the Senegalese have the impression that certain Senegalese who are on the side of the powers that be are protected. Why are those in opposition often mistreated? If a state is unable to manage these 3 Ds, depatrimonialization, depersonalization, and differentiation, then we are not in a process of establishing a republic or a state. If you've noticed, since independence, the number of coup d'etats that have taken place on the continent as a result of this democracy is extraordinary. In other words, institutional coup d'etats give rise to military coup d'etats. If someone who has been elected decides to change the constitution and adapt it to suit his own whim, then the consequence is that it will create frustrations, and these frustrations will make other people want to regain power. In general, when they are in opposition, they are in favor of limiting the power of the president. They are in favor of greater independence of the judiciary. But once in power, they change their minds.
Between 1970, after May 68 and 2000, there was nothing but progress and significant advances in the field of democracy. The past 12 years of the incumbent president's rule have shown us that democracy has certainly taken a step backwards. We are witnessing a restriction of our individual freedoms, our freedom of association, our freedom of demonstration, our freedom of expression, and this has culminated in the internet being cut off and cut off again.
I was talking earlier about social networks and the importance of the internet. People who aren't invited on a television channel that belongs to the whole of Senegal will find another means of expression. The means of expression they have found, or at least the space for expression they have found, is social media. And as everyone is on social media, the amplification is much greater. So what's going on? You don't necessarily need to go to RTS to make your statement because you'll never be invited there. So what's happening? There's been a complete break. All TV stations that are more or less close to the government are being boycotted. We also saw a journalist who went to a political demonstration almost get beaten up. So there's a very big upsurge among a section of the young people who are disgusted with politics.
I feel like I'm watching a film about my country. A film that has an impact on viewers. And in 2021, it's as if we have been given the film again with a different impact because we were expecting a change, a progression, a breakthrough. There has certainly been progress, but there has been a lot of damage. We experienced some rapid progress, some breakdowns, a changeover that surprised us all, but which was deserved because it was a process of struggle that Abdoulaye Wade led with other social forces, with the flourishing of the trade unions, with forces that were sometimes even religious, the Mustachidines. All these events that we experienced in 1993 to 1998, which today are irreversible. Of course, as everyone knows, there is no going back. So we have taken some giant steps in this country. And today, we are in the era of mentoring too, which can be appreciated in many different ways. But of course, it's always a stumbling block because it allows the powers that be to select, to be the master of the game, and therefore to always control the process.
The issue of the drawing of lots is one that severely limits democracy because the choice of a president of the republic cannot be linked to what is known as the drawing of lots, which presents enormous difficulties in terms of equality in relation to the candidate, doesn't it? A file that is not made public, that the players cannot use and on which they are nevertheless judged. These players are a problem.
If those who symbolize or represent the institutions are unable to respect themselves and the institutions they are supposed to represent, there is a problem. Those who elect them will inevitably mark or consummate a divorce with them because, quite simply, they no longer recognize themselves in them. And that's the problem with our democracy.
That's the same thing, so I say to myself, but what's it got to do with? Is it cultural issues or is it? We don't think enough about our relationship with this power because there are different skills. The people at the bottom do exactly the same things they criticize.
If I wasn't a candidate, do you know that no one in my government would be going to work? Who wants to be working?
What about the issue of presidential term limits in Senegal?
I'm telling you straight out, I think in this day and age, 2 terms are more than enough at the head of a state.
If I am elected for 7 years, I undertake to serve only 5.
Because I've limited the number of terms to 2.
And this reform, which will limit the number of terms of office to 2 and the duration to 5 years, could no longer be amended.
I have the right to contradict what I see. I disclaim.
In Senegal, the issue of presidential term limits is at the heart of debates on the future of democracy. It is a barometer of democratic health, a reflection of aspirations for greater fairness and renewal in political life. What lessons can we draw from the Senegalese experience?
If Macky Sall had decided very early on, neither yes nor no, but that he would respect his 2 terms, we wouldn't be where we are today.
There was still the problem of President Macky Sall keeping his word. And so he did not want to settle this question once and for all. Does he intend to serve a 3rd term? Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest president of the United States. After 2 terms in office, he was only 50 years old. There were no term limits in the US Constitution. It was David Dwight Eisenhower who put it in the Constitution. He was naturally a very rigorous military man. So during the Cold War, he put it in the Constitution. But before that, there was no such thing. That's because, quite simply, George Washington, the first president, John Adams, right up to Theodore Roosevelt, served 2 terms and then left. He came along, he was young, charismatic and all, and people wanted him to serve a 3rd term. But to respect the honor of the democratic heritage of the United States, he agreed to serve 2 terms and left. Go to Benin. Do you know what they wrote in their constitution about the system? Nothing. No one can serve more than 2 presidential terms in their lifetime. In other words, it's not consecutive or successive, and so on. During your lifetime, you cannot serve more than 2 terms. Full stop.
Why wasn't this the case in 2011? We were still in a phase of constitutional transition. Now that Macky Sall was in transitional phase in 2016, as you so rightly pointed out, with the new constitutional reform, Macky was in limbo because he straddled 2 constitutions. His term straddled 2 constitutions, and he could play on that ambiguity. But now, I think that this stage has been definitively resolved. So to resolve it, we must first secure the constitution. No more touching it.
And we have no confidence in the Constitutional Council. And we know that serious decisions by the Constitutional Council have led to deadly conflict in Côte d'Ivoire.
You know, in a democracy, what you absolutely have to avoid, even on a personal level, is wearing down power.
I remember something President Wade said to me in an interview. It's made a big impression on me at the time. He used to say that after so many years in power, you become unpopular with the population. So at a certain point, it's good that those who lead us say to themselves that I have 2 terms to succeed in my mission, or at least to lay the foundations so that those who come after me can continue. When Wade came to power, the euphoria led to the appointment of mediocre people to certain positions of responsibility. What we are experiencing today are the consequences of Wade's governance.
That's why we are saying that we need to take a good look at the legacy, to take stock from 2012 to now, to see what we need to take from this legacy. If we want liberal schemes and what we need to throw away.
That's why the democratic game is interesting. The very fact of limiting terms means that from the first day in office, people will say to themselves that we are here for a specific mission. Let's do our job and leave.
When I look at the American Constitution, they talk about a renewable term of office once. But that hasn't created a problem there. Here, we try to lock into the text for 2 terms. But that created a problem. It's a question of the people. It's a question of the people because people will always find ways of saying no. But the question of 2 terms has not arisen in the United States. People serve their 2 terms and leave. And yet, their constitution is open to it. But the debate has never arisen. Why does the debate arise here, even though we've tried to correct it? And I think we have to do what the United States is doing. And today, we have seen Trump with all the problems he has created. In other words, 2 terms. 2 terms, respect for the Constitution, and not start fiddling with the Constitution like what they did all the time. And that the Constitution is not only adopted, but accepted by the majority, if you like, of citizens. For me, 2 terms is the ideal.
The possibility of being re-elected for another term and a big risk for the performance of our states. And that's why I'm with those who think that we should move towards a single term of office. Perhaps revise the term to 7 or 8 years. But we are elected for a single term. but with, at the end of it, a very powerful accountability mechanism.
Un seul mandat. Mais avec, à la sortie, un mécanisme de redevabilité très puissant.
If we had a single term of office, the president would know that he was going to serve one term and then leave. Well, I think that would be an excellent thing for governance. It would make it possible to fight corruption more effectively. It will make it possible to pacify the political arena because opponents would say to themselves, well, he's in for one term. I can wait anyway. And it will make it possible to have real elections in which citizens will choose a term.
We always say that alternating power is a democratic breathing space. One power, two terms, and that's it.
One power, two terms, and that's it.